emphasize that, how many have been there? Okay, how many of you know that you can do a virtual tour? Okay, I went a long ago, time in a special period, very difficult. I went, the caregiver said, well, I'll be back in 15 minutes. I said, oh no, I want to stay here. And I had a little Instamatic camera, and there was no place to sit down, so I was just excited. And I'm like, oh, it's not a typical tourist. You know, she's taking hours here. Anyway, what I want to say is you don't have to do that. You can take a virtual tour. So do it, because it's a good way. Some of you have asked about a biography. It's a good way to see physical aspects of his life. So I recommend it. Now, the other reason for mentioning where he was born is to say that it's just really important to emphasize he was born in slave-owning Cuba. We can talk about some of this kind of idealistic views about the 10 Years War and whether slavery was really bought, it wasn't. But I want to emphasize, you saw the movie El Ojo del Canario, and you saw some black presence in that film in Havana, right? And in fact, we have engravings, pictures of street scenes of Havana in the 1850s. He was a young boy in the 1860s, and that show a pretty robust black presence in the streets of Havana. We also have, there's a lot that Martí wrote about race that reflected his memories of childhood was written when he was older, in his notebooks written in the United States. But one of the things I want to mention is he had, and I think the film El Ojo del Canario gives a good idea about the time with his father in Tampa, so I won't cover that so much. But he has some notes when he had a section that he called Mis Negros, my Negroes, my blacks, and they're in reference. Some of them say, really kind of allude to black dignity. He talks to an old black man who said he was like an oak. I mean, I think these are basically favorable descriptions, like an oak. And he uses the term, my translation, desolated majesty. So there are times when he basically confers dignity on people that he remembers from childhood in Havana. And then the other thing, I'm going to bring this up because you just never want to forget how harsh slavery was in the United States and also Cuba. And I say that particularly because today in the United States, we have people promoting an idea that, and there have even been textbooks, there was a textbook in Texas that suggested that slaves, that people came from Africa looking for work. So, I mean, I'm saying this, it's an important issue because misinformation is going out there. And there are some ways in which both systems are equally bad, and I think there's some ways in which the system in Cuba, particularly in the countryside, was quite a bit worse. But back to the references. These are just ephemeral things, but he talks about a black man with a severed hand. So, you know, an allusion to the kind of punishments that people could have suffered. I mean, there are certainly lots of examples about that. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to this place in the valley of the Valle de los Ingenios, valley of the sugarcane mills and plantations. It's out from the city of Trinidad, in the southern part of the island. And to me, it's a place where one can begin to grasp what slavery was like for someone working. Now, I use the word mill plantation. I want to explain that. It's quite different from slavery in the U.S. The kind of crops that were grown in Cuba and the kind of crop typically pictured with slaves in the United States, which is cotton, right? Anyway, so slaves in Cuba could have been working in coffee. Many were working in sugarcane. That was the worst worst possible place to be. And although we had sugar growing in Louisiana, and you might want to remember in one of those wonderful orations that Martí gave in Tampa, he actually alludes to the sad sugar cane from slaving, right? So it's just a memory stuck in there while he's traveling south to Tampa. All right, what was it like to work in sugarcane in Cuba? I really want to take a little detour here. Because I had a hard time convincing my students just how brutal it was. More men than women, although women also. And the field, when I say plantation mill, the word engenho, in Portuguese, suggests a kind of agriculture factory model. So sugarcane was grown and then it was processed there. So the result was that sometimes slaves, and I'm not exaggerating, worked 17-hour days. And in fact, Franklin Knight and others have suggested, we don't have a perfect way to assess this, that the shortest lifespan of slaves in America was a worker on a cane plantation. 7 years, they died and they were replaced. Just relentless, hard work, and very harsh punishments. So a way to reference this, I won't go way into literature, but I know some of you are interested in that. Wonderful Cuban writer, Alejo Carpentier, and Carpentier because he spoke French, Carpentier, both ways to say it, right? Wrote a story that I particularly like called Journey to the Source, Viaje a la Semilla. And it's a story about a family in Havana where time moves backwards. It's a wonderful story for magic realism, right? But, as José Martí in his brilliance has pointed out, it's a symbol for how the sugarcane industry distorted time. What do you mean 17-hour days? Things were inhuman. So in this very magical realism way, it's also pointing to this very harsh reality. I want to mention one more thing that happened actually before Martí's time, but to give you an idea. 1844, the Rebelión de la Escoba, the year of the lash, escalera. Muy mal. Escalera, la conspiración de la escalera, the ladder conspiracy, right. And this was, people feared slave revolts. I also have to bring up here that the Haitian Revolution, which resulted in a free independent nation, Haiti, in 1804, terrorized white plantation owners. And some of them moved to Cuba, actually. So there's that French influence in the eastern part of Cuba. But, all right, back to this Conspiración de la Escalera. News, the rumor of a slave uprising, there was that constant sort of fear. And so people were rounded up, they were put on ladders, that's why conspiracy of the ladder, right? And whipped until they revealed something, or maybe didn't. It was really harsh punishment. And I'm just saying that this is before Martí's time, it's kind of symptomatic of the kind of fear and punishment that took place in Cuba. The other thing I'm showing you about Racon at Manaca is Nada, because I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert on slavery in the U.S. We often see individual slave cabins, but typically in Cuba it was one great big place. There was just very little privacy, relief, any kind of freedom from a life of torment. So many people would have been crowded into this one type of dwelling. Not that there weren't some other individual buildings, but these slaves did not have individual family cabins like was the case in some places in the U.S. South. Again, I want to contrast that these were both slave-holding societies. It impacted both of them because before the Civil War, when the United States was debating slave states, free states, in addition to the people in Cuba who said, oh, let's be annexed to the United States, there were slave-holding states in the South that said, let's annex Cuba. It's big. Maybe we can get 4 slave-holding states out of that. So there was this push and pull about that. But slavery was different in some fundamental ways in these two countries. And one of the ways it's different is the kind of agriculture and the toll that it took on the workers. And another way that it was different is that Britain, now having less interest, commercial, financial interest in the slave trade, became righteous. And I won't say it's just economic. I think you want to give some credit to the powerful moral forces. A sweep of abolitionist fever, or fervor, both maybe, really pushed England to crack down on the slave trade. Now, you can see a variety of dates, historians can help me out, but basically after 1920, Britain was pressuring everybody to stop the slave trade. And the Spanish signed treaties, it's sort of like the U.S. treaties with the Indians. They signed treaties and then they did not comply with the treaty. Now, what happened in the United States is that you had far fewer slave ships coming in to the United States, bringing slaves from Africa. Some of you may have read in Mobile, Alabama, they have unearthed the slave ship that came as late as sometime in the 1860s. Very unusual. For the most part, slavery continued in the U.S. through the new slaves being born, but not slaves coming from Africa. So this means a couple of things. Less direct contact with Africa, a greater desire among the slaveholders in the South to keep a steady supply of slaves. So make sure they reproduce. I want to ask how many of you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave? Raise your hand. Okay. Well, I'm glad you did, because if you remember, in that movie, isn't it a true story, right? Of a man, a freed man from the North, actually worked in Canada too, who was kidnapped and taken south because they needed slaves. So they did have people who were kidnapping free blacks to keep up the supply. I'm just saying this makes a difference between the U.S. and Cuba. Now, in Cuba, the slave trade continued. The governors, captains general they were called, in Havana, got bribes. I mean, they lived off of this sort of thing. There was one captain general called Dionisio Vives, V-I-V-E-S, and they used to say, si vives como vives, vivirás. If you can live like Vives, you're going to live well. Because this bribery money kept coming in. So, in Cuba, slaves kept coming in. You'll remember that Martí's father was charged with suppressing the slave trade. A noble task, hard to fulfill, but he tried. This also meant that Cubans had a more readily available supply of African slaves who could be brought into work, and along with that, a stronger connection to Africa. So I don't think this is emphasized enough. It really makes these two chattel-owning societies similar and yet different. Slave sales. This was a really important discovery for me, then looking at this topic, because in the 1850s and the 60s, remember slaves were coming in, there were announcements about slave sales in Havana. And here are two, I don't have the date for them. They're in Spanish, so I'm going to give some highlights to you, because they're going to contradict something he wrote about slavery in the United States. But these are just published slave, like announcements, flyer, you know, and Martí never commented on slaves, unless we find something new, commented on slave sales in Cuba. Why? He didn't want to emphasize that. He wanted to say, as a result of the 10 Years' War, that the movement had abolished slavery. Of course it had, but it was what I call a strategic illusion, something he wanted to promote. So he exaggerated. All right, now why does this topic of slave sales matter? All right. There's certainly plenty of testimony to slave sales besides these announcements. There are anti-slavery novels. He also said very little about them, right? The ones in Cuba. But let's look at what he says about the sale of slaves, and then we'll look at what he says about the slave sale in the United States and what it reveals about his sensibilities. All right, so the first one, and actually I'll just tell you something I did in a class that was one of the most effective things I ever did to help students understand. I have a book that describes these slave sales, and so just like these little, papeletas, anuncios here, the announcements here, I cut them out, I put them in a basket, and I told every student to take one. This was in a class where I could speak Spanish. And then I asked everyone to take one. And then they were to read it as if maybe they were the person being sold. You know, they had to read it. And when they came to this one, the class kind of stopped. A black woman, recently having given birth, abundant milk, excellent washwoman and ironer, knows how to work in the kitchen, etc., seen touches, she hadn't been punished, didn't have bruises. And then another one. These two are the ones where people kind of stopped and said, oh my, all right? Another one, a black woman, because her owner doesn't need her anymore. And then this is typical in these slave sales in Cuba, to mention the place in Cuba, in Africa where they were from. Mandinga, Conga, the Cubans are nodding, they know, right? What is the saying? Right. So those are things that are very familiar to Cuba, that you know the nationalities of the slaves who were brought in. All right, she's 20 years old. She has a baby, 11 months old, fine, in pretty good health. She's pretty faithful and humble, etc. And you know, some of you will remember from 12 Years a Slave that women and children were separated in the sales, right? But I think for my students, the idea of a woman who just had a child being put on the market that way just kind of stumped class and made them think hard about it. Now, the connection with Martí in the U.S. Remember, he did not write about these slave sales in Cuba. But he read the U.S. newspapers, and we're going to come to this later. But basically, Martí lived in a time after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, but at a time that the nation was reliving those events, with just wealth of information, kind of looking back to Civil War generals, the battles, the events, and the abolitionists, and people gave talks about abolitionism, and John Swinton, actually a Scotsman, was one of the prominent abolitionists who spoke, and this is from his speaking to a black church in the United States. And what Martí does is look at this comment and kind of soften it in his commentary in Spanish, because the comment by John Swinton. He says, I remember seeing a slave sale in South Carolina, and there was this lovely, comely, beautiful black woman, and the slave auctioneer, made comments about, oh, she would be a nice one, boy, making these kind of comments, and then also said that, yes, I'll read it to you. Adelina, in fact, Martí uses a similar word, Adeline or something like that in his version in Spanish. But here's what John Swinton said. Adelina, a comely mulatto of 18 years who clasped in her arms a pale-faced, blue-eyed babe. She was recommended as a good housemaid, excellent seamstress, but her sex and youthful attractiveness were subjects for the auctioneer's chief consideration in terms too vile and brutal for repetition. Like, here she is. Well, what's the other thing here? Race mixing. All right, she's a mulatto. How did you get to be a mulatto, right? A white slave owner having usually unwelcome relations with a black slave. And she is holding a baby who is pale and has blue eyes, right? So she's a mulatto, and then this child, too, is going to, male and female, be a mulatto and mulatto. All right, Martí does not go there, right? He simply suggests that this woman was sold at an auction in South Carolina, and her attractiveness was mentioned. He has a reluctance to talk about sex with slavery, and they're so intertwined. Yes?
I think Melissa, you were first.
Yes, yes.
My question was just going to be, that activity seems very engaging. Do you have any thoughts about, have you had response from students of color about when you've done that activity in your class?
Oh, I have students of color.
I know, I was just wondering if there were any concerns about how students of color might have responded to that activity?
I get where you're coming from, and it's certainly important. My point in the class, my class has always some students of color, mainly, I'll just tell you so you know, mainly they're Hispanic American, mainly of Mexican background. And I try to always not offend people, right? But I said I want you, because I'm going to just digress a little bit and say, I have students who work in fields. I have students who work in coffee in Central America. I mean, who know physical labor. None of them had really gotten an idea of what slavery in the 19th century in Cuba was like. And so that was the idea. And I just tell you, they just stopped. When they got to the part about the woman in the truck, just had a baby, and they just stopped. Also very sensitive to family relations, so that just stopped the class. No one protested, but your question is a good one, because it is very important to be tasteful and not it's a touchy subject sometimes. Anyway, thank you for the question. So, did Martí write about, we have powerful and not so powerful anti-slavery novels in Cuba. The big one, of course, is Cecilia Valdez, right? By Silvio Villaverde. And, this isn't a literature class. I'll just say there are others too. Martí wrote about Villaverde, but only to say, oh, I'm glad he's supporting the independence movement. I'm just positive he's really never read the whole book. He does write about Uncle Tom's Cabin. He didn't read that either. He just comments on it. But it's interesting that some of these things about race come in the context of the United States and not in Cuba. All right. Now, remember that before the Civil War, there was this interest between Cuba and the United States, basically over slavery. And then there was a sympathy in the United States for the cause of the Mambises, the rebels. So I hope you have these great big wonderful screens. I hope you can really see that. Mane of a lion. Okay, so you've got wonderful visuals here. This was a poster that was produced in the United States.
Underneath the foot, the right foot.
Right there. See, and it's round. That's Spain, right there, okay? So this was published in the United States in the middle of the 10 Years' War. And you see the slaves in chains. You can maybe see, you see the people on horseback here, the rebels, keep things on fire, because they set things on fire. Here's liberty, of course, is white, right? So there she is, with the Cuban flag, Cuban symbols, and then Spanish priests, right? This one I have to say, I'm not positive, but take a look at this and see what you think that means. Anyway, it's indicative of the kind of things that went on between Cuba and the United States. Interest in Cuba for nefarious reasons, and interest in Cuba sometimes with noble intent that they should be free. Did I hear a question? Okay. All right, so New York, 1880s, just to show, because Martí went for the first time to New York, to 1880, but also look at the building. I want this to really be a symbol of how different New York in the Gilded Age was from Havana, right? The kind of buildings, the structure, the architecture, the solidness. It was, he came from Havana to a modern and modernizing city. There were overhead elevated streetcars, just a whole lot of things. Very, very, very different from Havana. And of course, it was cold. It was very cold. I remember in 2002 going on a walking tour of Martí's New York, and we all were just, what was the video at the end? We went all the way, kept thinking, oh, Martí, and little, thin black coat. Anyway, it was a big change. That's what I'm trying to say. And in so many ways, we traveled in Europe, but just contrasting this city where he lived with Havana would have been a very, very big change. Now, Martí, in the film you saw, Ojo del Canario, you saw the experience in Matanzas, and Tomás, he refers to this old black man he met there. He refers to the fact that he saw slave punishments there. And that's reflected in his poetry written much, much later. But what's interesting is that in the United States, he saw blacks who were free and lived a very different kind of life. And two of them, one is Rafael Serra, who worked with Martí in La Liga, this educational enterprise for people of color, Puerto Rican, Cuban, mainly in New York, and who, after Martí's death, wrote a magazine called La Doctrina de Martí, very, praising what Martí had meant. And then the other person you heard about her, and here's the connection with Tampa, Paulina Pedroso. Paulina and Ruperto Pedroso made a place for Martí in the boarding house they had in Tampa after after the poisoning attempt. And what Ruperto said was, I'm not sure Susan Greenbaum mentioned this or not, but Ruperto said he slept outside the door of Martí's room to ensure his safety. The couple felt very honored to have Martí with them. And in fact, again, these are going to sound exaggerated to you. I think you have to take yourself back to how people spoke, context in which they gave it, but I don't see condescension here. But Paulina Pedroso published comments about Martí. that were just very effusive. She said, here's my translation, about Martí. I loved you as a mother. As a Cuban, I revere you. I idolize you as precursor of our liberty. And so, you know, I want to keep coming back to this. The impact Martí had as a person, his words, his gestures, his generosity. In the book by Blanca Cinta de Varal, she says, in the midst of all this activity, she said, I need to get a gift for the daughter of this lector. Someone who was going, he was thinking about kind, he was thoughtful, kind. That's something you just don't, you get immersed in the poems and the wonderful testaments to a struggle for justice. And you kind of forget the person who was manifesting these good qualities was important too. All right, this is a part of a story that Esther has related in translation, and that became available in Spanish only recently. And it's a 3-part article. You have it, right? And I'm forgetting the title. Trial. A town sets a black man on fire. And actually, there are 3 parts to it. This again from the newspapers. I actually looked at a whole bunch of Texas and Arkansas newspapers to see what they said and what might have gotten to Martí in New York for his chronicle. But there are 3 parts. One is blacks who were thinking, this is enough. Okay, I'm going to Liberia. Remember, Liberia was established as a place that blacks could go and form another life different from what they had in the U.S. And then there's this terrible account about a man who was burned to death at the Texarkana border. His name was Coy. I want to give him a name, C-O-Y, not a nameless person. And the accounts say that he accosted a woman, the typical wording, again, these are 19th century accounts. They tended to say outraged, kind of a cover word, raped, right? You don't see that word very often, but that's what it was. The woman was outraged, right? So anyway, this woman said she had been outraged and assaulted by this man. And so the town took Coy, took him to a stake, doused him with fuel, and Mrs. Jewell, that was her name, Mrs. Jewell came and lit the match, and people watched. Now, one of the things I want to mention here, and particularly thinking of my Cuban friends, right? The period of time that Martí lived in the United States after Reconstruction was the 1880s, or 1892 was the year of maximum lynchings in the United States. Was a period of time where this is just going on all the time. And I think I got a feel for it by sitting in the New York Public Library and reading newspapers. And I thought, okay, I'm going to be like Martí, I'm reading the paper. Over and over and over again, there was an accountable lynching. I just think it weighs on you. I'm sure you know. So he may not have written about every one. He did report on several, but the fact is that cumulative effect of hearing these accounts as people in the South took back. They went back. After Reconstruction, you might remember, those of you who are not avidly engaged in U.S. history. After the Civil War, federal troops moved in to supposedly help the black population get rights, recover rights. There was a slogan, 40 acres and a mule, never happened, right? And so when federal troops left, whites took over again. And you have this whole really dreadful series of events. Now I want to contrast something that to me, not negate the horrors of slavery in either country, but it's quite a difference. There are two or three things, the images that people have, and why you have to be careful not to impose your cultural image on somebody else's history. So for example, all right, here you have an account of a spectacle of people watching. Now, anyone who reads Cecilia Valdez or Saab or any of these other, won't name all the anti-slavery novels, or reads about the Year of the Lash or any of that, is going to say it was terrible. Where is there an account in Cuba of a crowd watching someone being put to death? I didn't find it. Okay? The other thing that's very different, I had students say, oh, I know what that's about. In the United States, the idea of lynching is a mob either burning somebody or hanging somebody, right? And in fact, one of the things I saw in researching for this, it's kind of gruesome, I hate to talk about it, but it's real, okay? There were postcards, some of this goes way into the 20th century too. Postcards that said, Negro barbecue, all right? In addition to that, there were all these hangings that people watched. And sometimes they tortured people to death. These were public events. Now, the big difference in Cuba, remember the need for slaves, all right? So, slave owners in Cuba did not want to lose a slave. So they did not want to go hang a slave. They put slaves in stocks. You know what those are, sickly video. I know you put in your family, and sometimes slaves who wanted to die swallowed their tongue to get out. Luke Perez has a wonderful book called Dying to be Free, and it's about slavery in Cuba. And so in Cuba, remember the idea of the image we have of somebody hanging in the U.S., people hanging somebody to get to punish, or maybe a crowd watching it, right? In Cuba, that was a slave who tried, I'm ending this. It was suicide. Dying to be free. So very different, yes.
Although that, so this is the 80s, 20 years after the end of slavery in the United States, so the comparable time in Cuba would be in the early 20th century.
Not necessarily.
Since slavery doesn't end there until after 1886.
That's right. Slavery limps to a close in 1886 after the Lorette Law. Right.
So, but we do see acts of violence against Afro-Cubans.
Oh, yes, the massacre in 1912. But what I'm talking about is spectacle, people being hanged. Let's go, right, and slavery ends in Cuba. The importation of slaves technically is 1886, 87. There's some accounts going right up to that. And then slavery ending in 1886. What I guess what I'm trying to say, I hope I'll make it clear, is that in Cuba, people were not likely to end a slave's life by hanging. They needed the slave labor.
But in the 80s in the U.S., they wouldn't be slaves.
This is a free
No. Okay, let me go back. Okay. In Cuba, they did not hang slaves. If you saw, like Martí said, a slave hanging from a tree, it was probably a suicide. Look at Luke Perez's book. He's the expert. And he makes the claim they've died. I'll go back to Africa this way. Now, in the United States, I'm just contrasting images, right? Because I had students say, oh, I know, because I have these images, but the images in the U.S. are different from the images in Cuba. Because in Cuba, there's no spectacle around somebody hanging from a tree. That's a slave committing suicide. The image, regardless of the dates, the period of time we're talking about. Does that make sense? Have I answered your question? I'm not talking about whether the time periods are exactly equal. I'm talking about the images of a hanging, a lynching, right? That in Cuba, you wouldn't call it a lynching because the slave has taken his own life, right? And in the United States, they're no longer slaves, right? You have Reconstruction, you have this terrible vengeance taken on black people in the South and the West after Reconstruction, and they are murdered. They are hung, and people come and watch it, and that goes right into the 20s and later in the United States. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, I don't think that, so I guess my point is that we do see a similar level of violence against Afro-Cubans in Cuba in the 20 to 30 years after the end of slavery, as Afro-Cubans begin to organize and gain advance. And this violence is directed against people who would dare to advance. I mean, so it's the same.
You're thinking of something in the 19th century?
No, in the early 20s.
Right, right. And yes, in an independent Cuba, yes. I mean, the massacre in 1912, I see that, certainly not to negate that violence. It's just nobody, big crowd watching somebody being burned to death. We don't want to negate the violence anyplace. I don't want to stay forever on this topic, but the images are distinct in regard to hanging. That's what I'm trying to say. These are two slave societies that have similarities and differences, and just the labor system tended to be more intense in Cuba. Again, if you saw 12 Years a Slave, I saw it again, okay? Remember the person who picked the most cotton? She had small hands, so she could pick the most cotton. Okay, hard work. She was abused. We don't want to overlook that. I'm going to come back to that movie in just a minute. But it's not like working 17 hours a day. It's just, that's why they had the highest death rate in the Americas, according to the experts. I want to give them the dignity that they're, and Martí has a wonderful quote. I hope I get it right. We must pay for the criminal wealth of our ancestors. Criminal wealth, that's what it was. I mean, he has so many wonderful sayings about justice, you know, and what's the other one? El esclavo desdora al dueño. Da vergüenza ser dueño de alguien, okay? The slave tarnishes the owner. You know, it's a shame to own somebody else. Now, I have a question.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, because I find this very interesting, that I think it also connects back to your point about the modernization happening in the U.S. at that time, because the thing with spectacle lynching is that it dovetails with the commodification of the whole culture. So the fact that, you mentioned the postcards, but they actually had trains set just to bring families from other towns in for the spectacle.
Yes, they
souvenirs.
did. They did, like a big event.
Yeah, so I think it is very specific to what was happening in the U.S. with commoditization as well.
Right.
Yeah, so, yeah, I don't know. If
I'll
that
just give you one more very quick example why I'm emphasizing images, because having taught in the U.S. for a long time, I know people sometimes have an idea. I remember somebody, I can't give you the exact context, talking about the ship and the blacks, and the person said, oh yes, the slaves are loading bales on the ship. And I said, no, the slaves are the cargo. See, because, I mean, that's, you might automatically think, oh, we have these images of slaves loading something on a ship, but in this particular context, the slaves were the cargo. All right, well, let's move on. I have one more thing to mention about this article. All right, we had the people going to Liberia. We had this terrible account of koi being doused with flammable liquid and put, dying in a terrible death. And the same article had something about the cakewalk. Now, I had heard in English the expression, it's a cakewalk. I had no idea what it meant, but I did a lot of reading to find out. And actually, it's really important. The cakewalk, and there's a history to this too. The cakewalk was a spectacle that was reported on in the newspapers at the time, and Martí reported on it, where blacks were encouraged to make exaggerated moves and kind of, just in as a spectacle for white audience. be very exaggerated in their movements. And then the couple, these were couples who would walk around like that. There was one at Madison Square Garden that Martí commented on. And then the people who were judged by the whites to have the best exaggerated would get a cake. Okay, it demeaned the participants. That's the whole point. It was playing to the stereotypes that whites wanted to see. Look, they're happy, they're moving, they're whatever. And in fact, I wish I could give you the title. It's a very good book. It's something like Shout, Leap About, something like that. Anyway, I can send it to you if anyone's interested. A book about how we have these stereotypes. Where do they come from? And it turns out, it's a very persuasive argument, that on the slave ships, to make sure that people didn't think the slaves were too mistreated, they would play some music and make them sing and dance. They say, look how happy they are. See the happy slaves, they're moving, they're dancing. Now, those of you who saw 12 Years a Slave, if you haven't seen it, go see it, right? May remember the time in the house where Patsy was with other slaves, and they would make someone play music and make the slaves dance to, then have a good time. So this is forced merriment to reinforce stereotypes. Now, that's one part of a bigger story, but it made me kind of see that in a different way. All right, abolitionism. Now, abolitionism was before the Civil War, so how come Martí is writing about it, right? And he's writing about it because in the years following the Civil War, there were times of reflection. And so you just read, again, all these magazines, Harper's Weekly, Harper's Monthly, North American Review, Century Magazine, the Herald, the Sun, these papers, they had information about abolitionists because they were kind of looking back at the Civil War, a lot about the Civil War journals. And so Martí started reading about these abolitionists. So there's a whole lot about not abolitionists in Cuba, abolitionists in the United States, who were basically in the North and basically moved from a moral compass that told them that slavery was wrong. And they were fervent. Those are the people who accepted people running away on the Underground Railroad. And there's actually a follow-up to this in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction efforts that is, I think, unique to the United States. So he wrote about many of them, a lot. John Swinton was one abolitionist, and he took that account about slave sale from John Swinton's commentary. But who are some others? Well, I don't want to be too political, but many of you know that Frederick Douglass belongs to the past. And we can't say, I hear he's doing great things. He did great things. A former slave, always described, invariably described as mulatto, because his father was white, never knew his father, and who had a distinguished career and ended up being, and wrote about his life, and Martí commented on that, right? And then served as ambassador to Haiti. Now, just to show you, Martí has sometimes conflicting values. When Frederick Douglass was ambassador to Haiti, and Martí was afraid that he was going to help the United States get access to Cuba, a pretty harsh light is shown on Frederick Douglass. This is not the person that Martí wants to get favor on. Another kind of little detail, and there are lots of little things in there. On the ship that took Frederick Douglass to Haiti, Martí comments that he was initially denied a place to sit with the captain's table. but he doesn't mention that Frederick Douglass's second wife was white. So there are just lots of little, you know, things that could slightly alter why things happened as they did. All right. The figure in the painting, anyone want to guess who it is?
John Brown?
Who said that? Who said that?
Yeah, I know. That's weird.
Who said it?
Several people said it.
Yeah.
Who said
Several
it?
people said it.
They hit it out 10 times.
You said it? I'll give you a copy of the book if you want.
Oh.
Yes, I will.
You all get a chocolate covered espresso bean.
Right. This is John Brown, who, and these were radical movements. John Brown and his sons in the 1850s were trying to end slavery, and they desired to capture the arsenal, the arms held at Harper's Ferry, what is now West Virginia. And their goal was to get the arms and give them to slaves in the South. Well, he was captured. He killed people. He killed a bunch of people, and he was captured. And there was a trial. This trial of 1859 was, you know, news that was covered, particularly in writing about abolitionism. And actually, the painting, the incident is apocryphal. The comments about it were just taken from something that didn't happen, and the painting describes something that never happened. But, fake news way back then. But the painting by Hammond was a noble idea, and Martí was very taken with it. Imagine, what was it? That on the way to his death, this is John Brown, who's been sentenced to death, killing all these people at Harper's Ferry, he stops to kiss a black child. So it was, you know, I think in a way, I don't want to say condescending, but anyway, it was a moment that for many people stirred some idea of compassion. Now, a lot of people did not agree with John Brown and his tactics. Can you guess an American writer who supported him? Emerson.
Really?
Emerson was a very vocal defender of John Brown, and a lot of people were not. Okay. Now, the topic of race is certainly a big one. And so there's a whole topic of Native Americans, the whole topic of terminology, what to say, what to call what Spanish Americans and Americans called Indios or Indians for so many centuries is certainly a big question. And it's one that goes all through Martí's works. Okay. Now, we are so fortunate to have here in this institute somebody who is working on indigenous presence in Cuba. All right? So, Kevin, do not be shy, all right? We tend to think of, and I think this is you know, we tend to have just sweeping ideas. I have many students who would come in and say, oh, los españoles llegaron, arrasaron, mataron, masacre, y no hay más indios. Spaniards came, they conquered, they smashed down, there are no more Indians. Of course that's not totally true. That's not even totally true in the Caribbean, where, I mean, that's what we sort of just, you know, we just took it in. So, actually, dedicated researchers, including one of our own, are looking at the presence today of indigenous culture and physical features and all the rest in Cuba. It's not, hasn't been highlighted, but it's coming out, right? And I say that to say, in Martí's context, in Cuba, he doesn't mention indigenous, American Indian. It is Mexico, and I know we have somebody, where is she, who's a specialist on, you have to raise your hand. Anyway, who's a specialist on Martí in Mexico, and that's where he really, there she is on the back row. Okay, don't be shy, we have a lot of expertise here. Mexico, you know, I think she's saying it's so true. We could say there's no Martí without the U.S. There's no Martí without Mexico. You know, he starts as a journalist there, he marries there, he becomes famous in some ways, and he, in quotes, discovers Indians, right? And I have to tell you, I say in this book, I really began to see Martí evolving, like many people evolve over time about lots of subjects. Anyway, his comments are not positive. They're not. He has comments, he also comments about Indians in Guatemala. There are kind of two facets to it. One, he saw downtrodden Indians who had been punished, relegated to lesser lands, to fewer opportunities, the whole political question with the Barrios government in Guatemala when Martí was there. But the bottom line is what he saw were people who didn't have resources and didn't have opportunity and had been neglected. And so that's what he described. Now, later we're going to see he has a remedy for that, and he thinks it's very important to remedy that. But those are the places where he foresees that. Now, and then you're going to see it at the very end, we'll come back to Nuestra America, because there are comments about blacks or African Americans and use the word Indians, Native Americans in Nuestra America that to me are crucial to meaning. So how you translate it is what kind of an impression you give to the reader. So, all right, some ways so we'll come back to Nuestra America. Remember, first published January 1st, 1891 in Revista Ilustrada. But there are other ways, and some of these are very directly impacted by the United States. Martí had hoped with Manuel Mercado to start a kind of a publishing business, and he translated quite a few things from the writer Helen Hunt Jackson, who was actually quite a good poet. It was said that Emerson carried her poems in his pocket, and so he translated some of her poetry. But he also wanted to translate her novel, Ramona. Now, Helen Hunt Jackson went to a show in New York, presentation about the plight of Indians, and she was very taken with that, and decided that that would be her cause. So she ended up being appointed to help the mission Indians in California, and she wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor. Martí names that. And she sent at her own expense a member to every member of Congress. Now, as some of you may know, it's hard to reach some of those members of Congress and persuade them, and they were not persuaded. So she thought, how can I get through how we're treating the Indians? So she wrote a novel. She holed up in a hotel in New York City and wrote. It's kind of interesting because her writing approach was kind of like Martí. She just got there and started writing. And she decided, okay, I'll make it a love story. And that way, people will read it. So she tells about a woman, this is a lot, Jonathan can help me out if I miss a detail, but she talks about a woman in California, Southern California, and her father is Scottish and her mother is Indian, yes, and she is raised by a Hispanic family, and the brother, not her real brother in the family, loves her, and her mother, it's involved. So let's just say she's raised by another family member, and she falls in love with an Indian. And the name that Helen Hunt Jackson, it's kind of mushy, she Italianized the story. So the virile Indian was instead of, and then we're gonna come to what happens with Martí. So we have Ramona and this brave, strong Indian, the love story. And then as the story goes on, they eventually do marry and have a child, and they just face hostility from the white settlers. And that's what Martí saw, that he wanted to see the Indians were mistreated and the Anglos were moving in, and in the end, I don't want to tell all of it to you because you should read it, okay? But anyway, Martí thought this was a way that he could show Mexico, watch out. Look what these Anglos did in California. Look how they treated the Indians. So he dictated fast, pacing on the floor like this with the book in his hand. You know this, we have an account, right? He dictated to somebody with a typewriter, you know, just translating fast.
Wow.
Remarkable job. Now, there are a few sections of Helen Hunt Jackson. By the way, that book has never been out of print. Helen Hunt Jackson's book, all over the place, right? And if you get to read what Jonathan is going to publish about the films, it's just a remarkable story in media. And as I mentioned earlier, in the 20s, it was a big rage, go to see Ramona's house. It was very, I can't overestimate how popular that was. Okay, well, back to Martí. Okay, so he's translating this book with the aim of selling it and promoting it in Mexico, and you know, getting some money from it. And in going fast, two things happen. There are tiny gaps, not much. When I think of the speed with which he did it, it's remarkable, and it's a good translation. And he actually improves. It's not a bad novel. He improves it in translation. But there were some sections. There's one whole section about kind of a country family, I could put it that way, have very slangy U.S. speech, very hard to understand. Well, why put it in there? So he reorders the chapters, leaves the parts that are not crucial out, and has this book printed. Worked with Manuel Mercado to get it distributed in Mexico. And guess what? Unfortunately, okay, these are Martí, it never ends, right? The book, the Helen Hunt Jackson one, it's in every library. Go to a public library, you're going to find it. Okay, Ramona in Spanish in Mexico, and again, I thank Jonathan for archival research in Mexico that showed that there was a little notice in a newspaper that Manuel Mercado put in Ramona, but it never sold. Okay, now, you don't have to answer. How many of you ever watched the telenovelas? Okay, all right. I've seen them. I've seen a whole bunch of them. And actually,
Bye, Victoria. Bye, Victoria. Have a safe flight.
okay, Brazilian. Oh, that's, listen, there's some of them. I saw it in Venezuela, then I saw it in Mexico, I saw it in Spain. Anyway, so what am I coming to? Recently, I'm trying to think the exact year.
It's been a while, since the 2000s.
2000. One of the Spanish networks did a telenovela, a soap opera, of Ramona, based on the Helen Hunt Jackson novel. Hello, there's a translation in Spanish. So, you know, I'm hoping that people who saw that, there are a bunch of movies too. It's actually a really interesting topic, how this whole subject has been portrayed in the movies. But anyway, that's that part of it. Now, I'm trying to watch time here. Okay. The other important thing is La Edad de Oro. And you know, remember Martí translated what he was interested in? He also cared about children. And he wanted, this magazine is full of moral lessons and things they should know about. So he talks about Ruinas Indias, the indigenous ruins. He took things from the big exhibitions that were being held in the United States, also news about the Paris exhibition. But here's what happened. In the United States, a man named Daniel Brinton, right? You probably remember that name, was writing about indigenous America, meaning the natives of the United States and the rest of the America. So there was a big interest in what happened to indigenous civilizations in Latin America. And there were explorers earlier in mid-century. There have been people who went to Yucatan, and there was somebody in Tampa where they did drawings and descriptions. So how did Martí find out about this? Not from Cuba, not from Spain, in the United States. So the reason he writes about all these things, and he wants children in the Americas to know about, is that he's getting this information in the United States and has all these sources of information, and prints it for them. He does comment. There's one comment, I think it's in one of the sections of the Agave Letter. There's a comment about the sacrifice that indigenous populations made. So you're thinking of the Aztecs and their gruesome spectacles. And then Martí kind of counters that with saying, well, what about the people in the Plaza Mayor in Spain who watched heretics burned to death right there? Right? I guess that's a spectacle. If you're going to say one, it's a burning of heretics, right, that took place. Anyway, so he contrasts. He doesn't try to say, you know, he tries to show justice has to show itself everywhere. All right.
Anita also wanted to
Yes.
just add to that, it had to have had an enormous influence in his travels in Guatemala
Oh, yes.
and through Mexico.
Right.
That to have seen these places as well, you know, that they believe he possibly visited Chichen Itza. They
Yes.
mentioned that, and yeah.
He went to some. I will tell you, I actually really researched this because on one trial in Yucatan, he went to some, but then somebody said, oh, these descriptions are so vivid. Of course they're vivid, but that doesn't mean he went there. So he didn't go to all of them. He does have a drawing of the chalk mold.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And in Guatemala, there are two things, the downtrodden, I'm using the word he used, Indians, and then his play, right? Drama Indio in Guatemala. Ooh, what a ferocious attack on the Spanish. I mean, it's, you know, it's unrelenting, harsh light on the Spanish. But really a lot of the information about indigenous America he got in the U.S. from print sources, from picture sources.
Well, you mentioned Brenton, and Brenton also
Yeah.
did work in the Caribbean.
Yes, yes,
But
not,
he never referred to Brenton's work in the Caribbean.
I don't think he did. He doesn't, no, I don't remember anything that says Caribbean.
And he did not refer to the work of Bachillet and Morales or Forti Rodan or any of the Cubans.
At the time, no, he doesn't. You know, he had what was before him. That's why we have researchers getting this out, right? All right, immigrant community. Yes, in a way, this does have to do with the topic of race. And, you know, Martí was in the United States at a time of great labor strife and conflicts, and so he wrote about the Haymarket riots. Those of you who haven't been reading U.S. history recently, it was about the conflicts between workers in the Chicago area who wanted better working conditions, and anarchists from, you know, with all of their political baggage from, not meant in a bad way, from Europe, who were giving speeches like it shows there. And in one instance, a bomb went off and it killed 6 policemen. So then there was a lot of fervor about who are these anarchists? You know, these people from Europe, they're just spreading these hateful ideas. And actually, Martí covers this over a period of time. At first, you're going to see this over and over again. At first, picking up on what he read, he was kind of sympathetic to they killed policemen, whatever. And then he realizes, what are their conditions? What are they longing? What are they fighting against? You know, work that was just barely giving enough for a family to eat by. People living in dire poverty, not a living wage. So he changes his perspective, and then he talks about the trial of the anarchists. And there was really no proof that they had planted the bomb, but it was this big news. He becomes more and more sympathetic. But this is the whole labor issues are certainly present in his chronicles. And then I'm so glad that Esther mentioned his writing about the Chinese cultural traditions, because he does write about many of those things with respect. He also talked about Chinese workers, and in fact, in California recently, we had a celebration that recognized that Chinese immigrants were essential to building the railroad across the United States. So, you know, long overdue a recognition of what happened. So, what happened here, and Martí describes Chinese workers several ways and several times. And he says they ate less, they asked for less, they worked harder. I'm summarizing what he said, which made people who wanted to be strike breakers, right, unhappy. That here were people who were willing to keep working, were not going to go on strike, and would keep working for these low wages. So this is a theme. Actually, this is from Harper's Weekly too. I keep mentioning these magazines because they are such vivid portraits of things he would read about or see, graphic images. And so there was a massacre on September 28, 1885, of Chinese workers in a mining community. I know it's getting late. I'll stop quickly and we'll do an exercise and we'll have time for questions. Okay. Now, another part of the whole topic that relates to race and social justice is the idea of U.S. racism. And aside, in these magazines, you're going to see the political cartoons, and you're going to see vicious racism, right? That also just flared up in the Spanish-Cuban-American War, and that spread its evil messages in Cuba. Pardon? Yes. Oh, not quite yet. Not quite yet. In just a moment. Right, okay. This is about race in America. This is your homework assignment. Okay. So this is the kind of cartoon you will see, and there are lots of them. And then Luke Perez he's just a wonderful historian. The book about 1898 has a lot of other visual images. So here's Uncle Sam, and here are his unruly, dark-skinned students. And they are Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. Right? So obviously this is after the Spanish-Cuban-American War. It's just unfortunately very typical of the kind of thing that wasn't present. And just one example of so many. So any questions before we go to the handout? Yeah.
Yeah, just as you just mentioned, this is a fantastic book, Cuba and the American Imagination, by Luke Perez, and it's just filled with cartoons like this. Yeah, for those who have not taken a look at it, it's a really excellent teaching tool as well. Whether you want to assign the book or just copy the images from the book and then put them on slides and what the students talk about them, it really gets good conversations going about the racial attitudes and sort of the gendered attitudes.
So glad you said that.
So I can't recommend this book highly enough.
Luke Perez, Cuba
Cuba in the American Imagination by Luke by
everything he writes.
Yeah.
America, what's it again?
It's Cuba in the American Imagination.
Right.
It's with
Right.
UNC Press.
Yeah, James.
Yeah, Anita, I wondered if you had an opinion about this, because I had a student a couple of semesters ago who was from the Dominican Republic. And he says that he didn't know much about Martí, but when they taught Martí at school, it was primarily, there's a famous quote of Martí where he seems to be disparaging Haiti, like not including Haiti within Nuestra America, where he says something to the effect of that. The way I interpret what Martí is saying is that the cultural circumstances of Haiti, the political circumstances of Haiti make it such that the best thing that the Dominican Republic could do is to seal off its border and try to establish its own sort of democratic system, because if they merge with Haiti, it's going to lead to, now I understand that in the Dominican Republic there's always been this very strong xenophobic fear of Haiti. But there's this quote from Martí that's taken out of context, and it says, that's really all we ever learned about Martí, was that Martí told the Dominican Republic.
We have to find it. I've never.
The quote, I didn't bring it, it's in my office, I found that quote.
What you want to be careful with is what's the context.
Right, exactly,
You know,
yeah.
I mean, if we had time, I would tell you, I'll just very quickly say this. There is a chronicle by Martí about an earthquake in Charleston,
Right.
South Carolina, that has what seem to be damning stereotypes of blacks. But I actually did archival work in Charleston. I have a different take on it because of that. You can look at it differently. We have an expert on Edward Standicat here who has written about Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And I think what it reflects, I'd love to know where it's from. It doesn't sound like Martí.
I will have it by tomorrow, because I have it in my
sounds
office.
very
the book,
much
yeah.
like, because Dominican Republic has been invaded. I mean, there's just, we don't have time to go into that fraught relationship, but I would be interested to see what it is. So, let's see, yeah.
I just wanted to ask what year this image is from? What year the image is from? What year this image is from?
Oh, I wish I could.
Wait a minute, I'm looking it up, it's in the library. It
is. I'm gonna just go back.
1899.
Yeah, that's right after the January Cuban American War. I will just repeat this again. Do not go to Wikipedia. Do not just go to these sites that have torture images. Go to the Library of Congress. They've got all this stuff digitized, and the information is right. And I mean, if you publish, you have to get permission, right? But you know, it's just got a wealth of information. Okay, now handouts. We're going to come back to the rest of America. Here's where you can divide into groups, okay? So, all right. So, anything else about the slides?
Yeah, can we take a short break while?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break.
Sounds very good.
Yeah, a little 10-minute break, okay. That's what I do.
That's so interesting about that.
Yeah, he's got a quote, and the thing was, is the way that I understand the quote is that he's saying, you know, that the political strife in Haiti is something that we have to be, we want to be careful about. But the other feeling I get is that it's used in Dominican schools to sort of to justify.
There's a quote from Martí.
It's a quote from Martí. I'm gonna go find it. I got it in my
Because I
office.
heard that something not from Martí, but who Confederación
It was left out of it. I bet there's, yeah, I'm sure there's something interesting.
So I heard the same argument, but not with Martí. I was trying to look those vacancies for offers, vacancies, but I cannot find it. So if you find the quotation, porque había escuchado argumentos anteriormente, pero y no tengo tiempo ahora. ¿Por qué no leímos a Lilian Guerra?
¿Quién es Lilian? Oh, Lilian Guerra. O sea, es una buena pregunta, lo puse en reserve, en parte porque yo acabo de leer el libro el mito de Martí, acabo de leerlo y nada, no se me había ocurrido invitarla. Pero yo definitivamente, si esto se repite, yo la voy.
And it has a lot to say about race, about racial groups. So in your handout, we can divide into 4 groups and then very quickly sum up, and I can give you some context about a couple of these quotes that you may not have thought about or known about. But Melissa has something to mention.
I just posted on the Slack that I looked up the Library of Congress catalog entry for that School Begins political cartoon, and if you click on TIFF, you get the uncompressed image, so you can zoom in and see like all of the details, and it was quite illuminating.
Discussion, you can do,
Oh, yeah. So if you just click on the thing, and then it'll give you options. You can get a JPEG and you can get PDF. But click on the TIFF image. It's a big, like 140 megabyte file, and relatively speaking, it's very large. But when you go in there, you can actually zoom as much as you want.
okay. One editorial comment before you can divide into groups. I don't know how we want to do that, but I put these two up here because, and actually since I created this, I have discovered some new things. Okay. I'm not just a friend of Esther Allen. I think she's just wonderful. And she is a great translator. So you cannot go wrong here, and particularly for Miss America. Now, I actually, for a presentation at LASA, went back and looked really closely. I mean, close reading, okay? So you do not want to use this book. You just put a big X. I read Nuestra America. I won't name the translator, but she should not touch Martí, okay? I read Nuestra America. In addition to all the big and little mistakes, I can just tell you 2 instances where she says the opposite of what Martí said. And it's important because she destroys the message. So you just can't give false information out. So, you know, tell your friends, this is, that translation's all over the internet, but it's just not dignified. It's not dignified. It's wrong, it's flawed, it's big mistakes, the opposite of what he's saying. So use the translation. So now,
You're saying this one is flawed?
No, the one on the
Oh,
right.
Yeah, no, that book, I know that book is serious. Is that a really good?
yeah, right.
She's right here.
She is so perfect. No. So it's just out there, people use it.
Who's the translator? I'm sorry.
I will tell you, her name is Eleanor Randall.
Okay. Well, I want to know how you find it, because a translation class, because we only compare the two texts.
Oh, well, let me tell you, you go back and look. I mean, I started looking at more things. It's not this. It's everything. It's just everything. And you know, I have to tell myself, okay, people, myself included, there's some of those, you read it, it doesn't make any sense in English. So, you know, you've got to tell yourself, okay, I can't give this to students. She's passed on. I don't fault. She just should not. She was rushed, but she should not. You should not be reading her translation to Martí. That's the only one. You know, because he's worthy of a good translation. You have good translators. I mentioned Esther, but also Luis Baralt and the other one I mentioned. Anyway, they're good ones. So use them. Okay. Now, do you want to divide in groups? I want you to.
Do you want to do it the same way we did yesterday? The
Yeah,
1, 2,
yeah.
3, 4?
And then we'll very quickly sum up some context for some of these. But take a look at them. Let's divide up and then,
Speaking
yeah.
of context, can I just, looking at this for just right now, I'm suddenly thinking of something that I saw in Cuba at a place called La Isabelita, which is a slave plantation. That's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's outside of Santiago de Cuba. And they, probably many from here Cuba know about this. I saw it for the first time there. There was something called the boca abajo, which is literally a hole in the ground. It was under the dining room, in this dark space under the dining room, but directly above, the master of the plantation would be having dinner with his slave, paramour. And the boca abajo was for pregnant women who would try to escape because they wanted their children to be born free. And it was literally hollowed out in the floor so that the pregnant belly, when the woman lay face down to be whipped, there would be like a space for the pregnant belly, but it was also clearly just like a symbol.
Right.
And it was in a room with all of these shackles. And somehow it seems like here, like the Indian running to the mountain for the children, it's almost like a conflation of Indian and black and the idea of the boca abajo, which is so present, running to the mountain for the freedom of the children. I don't know, I'm just suddenly having that image in my head.
Martí does say, he doesn't mention a woman, that they have a special torture way for the women is especially gruesome, but he does say whoever has seen a boca abajo and does not feel his cheeks burn with shame has something wrong with him, right? It's okay, you gotta work now, take a look.
So should we split them up in structured?